We met and worked with Kathy Terrell near the time ValleyFeverSurvivor.com began, while her brother Max Blalock was sick with valley fever. We were honored she stayed with us to help others even for years after Max passed away from valley fever in 2003. In this presentation, she shares some of what she wrote about his complicated tale of valley fever, including the problems caused by the disease and problems caused by unhelpful medical practitioners. She also shares information about Max himself to honor his life, and included pictures to show him as he lived.
My brother Max was 57 years old when he died from coccidioidomycosis, and that was over 9 years ago, getting close to 10 years now. Max was born a month premature and suffered with severe asthma until about the age of 11, when we moved from Oklahoma to Southern California. Everything that Max did in his life, he did at full speed. He always gave every sport or activity everything he had. He had been in so many car, motorcycle, and quad accidents and survived that his friends called him Max the Cat. When he was 27, he had a cracked hip and 6 ruptured discs in his back from several motorcycle accidents and a work-related accident. For 2 years, he could not stand up straight and walked bent over. It took several years of physical therapy for him to be able to do any of the things that he enjoyed doing. All through his life, he would have times when he couldn't do anything but lay down because of the pain he still had from it. But he never gave up. He was bitten by a brown recluse spider and spent 6 months in bed with his arm in a sling above his head. He had 3 surgeries to try and save his hand. The doctors told him he would never have full use of it again, but he did his own physical therapy for another 6 months and proved the doctors wrong. About 6 years before he got valley fever, he was in a head-on car crash that no one could believe he survived. He had every bone broken except for 1 leg and 1 arm. He had a titanium rod in his upper leg, 3 plates in 1 arm, and numerous screws to hold it all together. He had broken bones in both hands, his face, ribs, and clavicle. A year later, he went water skiing. There were many other accidents in his life, but now you know why they called him Max the Cat. He had a strong determination to live life and live it to the fullest. He surfed the North Shore of Hawaii and just about every beach you can name in Southern California. He drag raced, motocross raced, competitively water skied, was an avid gun collector, a marksman. He packed his own ammunition, loved quadding at Pismo Beach and the desert. One of his biggest loves was the love for children. He loved and taught them how to water ski, ride quads, or do any activities. He loved to work with kids in sports. He was in the Big Brother program for many years. Wherever Max was, you could be sure there were kids around. To them, he was just a big kid. He was a machinist and worked at General Atomics for a few years, making nuclear rods for power plants. He did auto body and painting. He loved anything with an engine and lots of power. I can remember when I would go to the drag races at Carlsbad Raceway with him. I was about 12 years old at that time when we started. He raced this 56 T-Bird called Maxie's Taxi. He named it after his first Maxie's Taxi that my dad built for him as a kid. After idling his car, waiting in line to race, the engine would start overheating. So every Saturday night, he would race, and every Sunday, we would spend replacing the head gaskets. I learned a lot from my brother. At 16, he built a tricycle with a 50cc motor on it in shop class. He taught me to pop wheelies with it, and I could outride all of his friends. We were close friends, even though 5 years separated us. Many people thought we were twins by the time I was 13 and he was 18. He bought me a surfboard for my 12th birthday so I could go surfing with him. I never got very good at it, but had fun just being with him. We double dated together. Mom knew he wouldn't let anything happen to me. At the age of 56, he was still water skiing competitively. His old back injuries were getting worse, and in December of 2002, he had back surgery. When he started feeling better from that, he was anxious to get back to doing what he loved.
When do you believe Max contracted his case of valley fever?
We believe that he got valley fever while working on his tractor on a small acreage in Terrell, California. That's about 60 miles north of Bakersfield. He had lived there for 27 years. He had 110 fruit and nut trees and was pretty much of a health nut. Most of his food came from the trees and garden. In April or May, he started feeling bad. At first, he thought it was, that was in 2003. At first, he thought it was his allergies. A couple of weeks later, he went to his doctor, and the doctor did a chest x-ray. He said he'd had pneumonia and gave him antibiotics. He wasn't responding to the antibiotics and was getting worse. I talked with him on the phone, and he was having difficulty even talking. I've had pneumonia many times in my life, and I couldn't understand what he meant when he told me he could feel poison going to his head. He said, "You know what I mean." No, I didn't. He said he felt really foggy, like there was poison in his head. On June 5th, a friend took him to the doctor again, and he was really out of it. The doctor sent him to the hospital in Porterville, where he passed out in his wheelchair. He had suffered a stroke, but they didn't know that yet. His attending physician tested him for TB and said it came back positive. She put him in isolation. I wanted to leave Oregon that day, but my mom wouldn't let me because she didn't want to risk me getting TB. I had a really hard time believing that was what he had. For one thing, my brother never ate at restaurants, only if he was traveling or away from home, and even then he packed most of his own food. He was incoherent, unable to walk, talk, or swallow. His liver and kidneys were shutting down. I started doing some research myself online. I know doctors hate it when we do that. I read all I could about valley fever. I read Buster's story, and it sounded like what was happening to my brother. I called the hospital and asked to speak with his attending physician. She returned my call a day later. I had difficulty understanding her as she was from India, but I asked her if she had tested him for valley fever because he hadn't been tested for it. She said no, she hadn't tested him. She tested him, and 2 days later, it came back positive. His titers came back 1/32. She started him on 800 milligrams of diazepam. By the next day, he was already showing improvement. He was more alert and trying to communicate, but it was really difficult to hear him. His liver and kidney function had improved also. As soon as I learned that it wasn't TB, my daughters and I drove to be with him and my mom. It broke my heart when I saw him like that.
It's okay.
As soon as I walked into his room, he reached for me with both arms and started moaning. He coughed horribly, and the stringy, smelly stuff that came up can't be described. It was so thick and stringy that it would get stuck halfway out, and he would start to choke on it. I grabbed a napkin and started pulling it out. It just kept coming, and he was unable to breathe. Mom grabbed a plastic knife from the food tray and started cutting through it the best she could. We finally got it cut off, and he was able to swallow it. And it went back wherever it had come from. It smelled horrible, like rotten yeast. It scared me to death. It was like something from a science fiction movie. His body had a strange odor also. He was so hot and sweaty. We had a fan blowing directly on him to try and make him comfortable. And this is in temperatures in the triple digits. It was summertime. The air conditioning was on, and Mom and I had to wear heavy sweaters just to stay warm. They were trying to feed him, and he kept choking. They would give him water through a straw, and he would choke.
Was this when you contacted me about his valley fever case and I suggested he be tested for coccidioidomycosis?
I believe so. It was such a blessing to be able to talk with you. I asked the doctor if he could have coccidioidomycosis, and she said no, because it didn't show up in the MRI. The CAT scan showed a stroke. They wanted to start feeding him through an NG tube.
For the people who are not familiar with an NG tube, a nasogastric tube is a type of feeding tube that's often used when people can't be eating on their own.
They inserted it after we left. A little while later, they called and said he had pulled it out and wanted permission to put it back in. I said no. Obviously, he doesn't want it. Several weeks later, a friend of my brother's who works in the medical field and knows people at the hospital came to visit him. He talked with a friend at the hospital and was told that the NG tube was inserted into his lung instead of his stomach. That explains why the next day, when we went back to the hospital, he had a raging case of pneumonia again, and they were suctioning his lungs. As if he didn't have enough problems, they were trying to kill him. A speech therapist came in to examine him and try to help with the swallowing problem. She was wonderful. What a change from the people we had been dealing with. After she talked with him, she asked if we knew that it was in his chart that he was a mentally retarded man. I was shocked. She knew from her examination that he was not. Where would they get that idea? The speech therapist said we needed to get him out of that hospital or they would kill him. She was going to try and help get him into a rehab hospital. We had a meeting with the doctor, and I asked her why she thought my brother was mentally retarded. She said that his family doctor told her that he was incompetent. I said that wasn't possible, as he knew my brother from his church. My brother taught his kids in Sunday school for several years. She had the audacity to tell us we were in denial. She is from another country and has a hard time understanding us, just as we do her. This doctor was trying to tell her that he was incoherent the day he sent him to the hospital, not incompetent.
I'd also like to add that it was a really good thing that he had the family support there, because sometimes when people don't have family support, all kinds of horrible mistakes are put into their charts by doctors who just didn't really understand what was happening.
Yes, exactly. And they are not in any kind of health to fight for themselves. They need someone there, an advocate, who knows something so that they can help get through what needs to be gotten through to these doctors.
Exactly.
That evening, my daughters collected pictures of Max through the years, showing his many interests in things he built. They made posters that said, Max before Valley Fever. When the nurses came in and looked at the pictures, they were shocked. And they treated him so much differently after they saw that and knew that he wasn't mentally retarded. We pointed it out to the doctor. She made a quick and silent retreat. She never did admit she was wrong or apologize. One morning when we came into his room, he was trying to tell us something. I could make out portions of what he was saying, and I would repeat it to him, and he would nod yes or no. He told us that during the night he needed to have a bowel movement and kept ringing the buzzer for the nurse. No one came. He tried to get out of bed and fell on the floor. He laid there until morning, until someone found him. I don't know how long he was dead. Another morning we came in early to find his oxygen off. He had been on oxygen the whole time, plus breathing treatments every 4 hours. I went out and asked the nurse if his oxygen was off for a reason. Now, this was a nurse sitting at the desk. She said she didn't know, but would ask. About an hour went by, and I went out and asked her again if she found out why his oxygen was off. She seemed like I was a bother and said no, but she would find out. Another hour goes by, and Mom went out and asked her about it. She gave the same response. After that, the nurse came in and said, "What is his oxygen doing off?" 4 hours had gone by. It's a good thing the nurse came in to give him his breathing treatment again. When the doctor found out we made plans to move Max to a rehab hospital, she was more than peeved. I asked her once again if it was possible that he had coccidioidomycosis. Once again I was told no, that it did not show up on the MRI. Silly me for thinking she knew what she was doing at that point. The day they moved him to the rehabilitation hospital in Visalia, he was really bad. He was still coughing up the crap they fed his lungs. Dr. Marconi was the head doctor at the rehab hospital. He examined Max himself. He could not believe what condition Max was in. He asked who the neurologist was his son. He was never seen by one. He asked about the carotid artery test. He hadn't had one. He looked at the chart notes from the other hospital and said they were garbage. There wasn't anything useful in them. He was very upset with the other hospital and doctor. I told him about them inserting an NG tube for feeding. He said they never should have attempted that in his condition. He needed a G tube directly to the stomach. He couldn't believe how stiff Max's neck was. He could hardly move it. He found a huge bed sore on his backside that was never mentioned at the other hospital. They checked Max in, and we left for the evening. As soon as we got home, we received a call saying he took a turn for the worse and was sent to another hospital in Visalia. I tried calling the new hospital to find out what was going on. He was in the emergency room. I asked to speak to an emergency room nurse. They transferred me there, but as soon as I told the nurse who I was, he gave the phone to Max. Max couldn't speak or even hold the phone. He dropped the phone, and I had to hang up. What is wrong with these medical professionals? Where's their common sense? I drove 45 minutes to get to this new hospital to find out what was happening. They didn't have any rooms available for him. They had to keep his head elevated so he could breathe, and he kept sliding down to the bottom of the bed, all crumpled up. Mom and I kept lifting his sheets and dragging him back up, only to watch him slide down again. Fortunately, the head nurse of the hospital came by, and she knew Max from water skiing. When she saw the chart note about being mentally retarded, she wrote over it in huge letters, "Big error." She found a room for him. They had a doctor insert a G-tube into his stomach so that he could at least get some nourishment. He was in this hospital for about a week. They had to turn him frequently and prop him on his side because of the bed sore. He would moan and grit his teeth because his joints hurt so badly. He never wanted to cry out. He had to be the tough guy. He did ask the nurses to be more gentle with him. I think they were trying to turn him quickly so as not to prolong his agony. I couldn't even move his knee 1 inch without him grimacing and groaning. They sucked more gunk out of his lungs than I thought possible for a human to have and still be able to breathe. When Max was sent back to the rehab hospital, Dr. Marconi had been doing his homework. He contacted Dr. Royce Johnson in Bakersfield, and they worked together on a treatment plan. They did a lumbar puncture and had it tested for coccidioidomycosis. His titers came back 1/128. They boosted his diazepam to 1,200 milligrams a day. He now had a pulmonologist and a neurologist. After being on his new dosage for 24 hours, we were amazed at the improvement. We came in the next day, and Max pushed himself all over the hospital in his wheelchair. He wanted to go outside so badly. We spent some time on the patio, but the triple-digit temperature drove us back in. He still suffered from the sweats. He had a busy schedule with occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, and pulmonary therapy. He actually had physical therapy twice a day, once in group and once with his own therapist. The days were like roller coaster rides. One day he would be improving, and the next he could hardly do his therapy. Sundays he could rest. He would sleep almost the whole day on Sunday. He not even a sip of water. I swabbed his mouth with wet sponges on a stick, and he would latch onto it and try to suck out any moisture he could get. He was so hungry, but was just on the feeding tube. His mouth and lips were so dry, and he begged for something to drink. He now had a yeast infection in his mouth also. The doctor said, "Go figure. He's taking meds for that in extremely high doses." They started him on a mouth rinse. Then they started him on a walker. He was getting a little stronger, but his heart rate would start going up, and they would stop. He never had high blood pressure or problems with his heart rate before valley fever. His friends would come visit him while in the hospital and rehab. He always put on a smile, and even though he couldn't speak loud enough for them to hear him, he would pantomime what he wanted to say. He kept his sense of humor and good spirits through it all. He joked around with the nurses and therapists. The social worker told me the first time she saw him, he was sitting up in his bed with no shirt and a sheet covering his lower half. She said she couldn't believe this was a sick man. He was so tan and muscled. That would all change as valley fever took its toll towards the end. Later, people mistook him for Mom's husband. He looked like a 78-year-old man.
You know, Kathy, I think it's important people realize that this is what valley fever can do to people. It can change a young, healthy, full of life man into an old and visibly and physically sick human being.
Yes, it sure does. It's amazing how quickly he grew old. It was unbelievable. But for a while, the physical therapy was helping. He was getting stronger, and they were working him more hours each day. He tried removing his catheter, but he wasn't able to urinate on his own. Dr. Marconi told us that Max had pushed himself past what he was physically able to do. That didn't surprise anyone who knew him. They had him on steroids for the inflammation in his brain caused by cocci. We wanted him off of those as soon as possible. I filled out an application for him to get his Belgican for free once we got him out of the hospital. It was like every other day was a good day, and every other day he would be extremely tired from the day before. One day he seemed to take a real turn for the worse. His heart rate was high even while at rest. His breathing sounded gurgly again. He was pushing his wheelchair and kept running into things as he would veer to one side. He was having a hard time hearing in one ear. I didn't know if stroke caused him to lose some use of the right eye and ear, or if it was the cocci. He seemed more confused and not talking as clearly as he had been recently. But the next day he seemed better than he had at any time before. What a roller coaster ride this was. Dr. Marconi said that his white blood cell count went way up, and he didn't know if it was from the high dose of digluten or lowering the dose of steroids. I would think lowering the steroids would help, but who knows. The speech therapist did a barium swallow test. They decided it was time to start him on some food. The therapist fed him slowly and taught him how to swallow. After 6 weeks, he was able to eat a little and was finally successful in getting rid of the catheter. But by the next day, he was too weak to even get dressed. He didn't sleep well because of knee pain. They stopped all steroids at that point, and maybe it was from the inflammation that he was having so much pain with his joints. The catheter had to be reinserted. Like I said, a roller coaster ride. After 4 weeks at the rehab hospital, he was finally able to go home with a walker. He was home for 2 days, and his fever went up again. The cough came back and was productive. He also started getting a yeast infection on his genitals. So a trip to the local doctor, and he was sitting in his wheelchair in the office for 1.5 hours, waiting to be seen. He refused to go back to the hospital, any hospital. We had home health nurses and physical therapists come to the house several times a week. And when Max's Diflucan was delivered to Dr. Marconi, he brought it himself to the house. It's a 45-minute drive from the rehab hospital. He said that Max was a miracle. If only there were more doctors like Dr. Marconi. We knew that we had to move Mom and Max to Oregon where I could take care of them. I couldn't stay in California forever. And he was a long way from where he needed to be. We made arrangements with doctors and started the process of putting him in a mobile home for them on a hardship case on my daughter's property. She lives across the road from me. It wasn't possible to put them on my property because of flooding issues. But when Max got to the point where Mom felt she could do it on her own, I went home to get ready to move them up here. Only a few short weeks, and they were getting ready to switch Max to a quad cane. He was walking several hundred feet with the walker and getting stronger. Then Coxie reared its ugly head again. This time there were masses growing on his adrenal glands. It caused him to have high calcemia and dehydration.
With the hypercalcemia, that is a common symptom in valley fever that is not often reported, and sometimes the high blood calcium can be incredibly dangerous to patients.
We immediately moved them up here. My brother's friends all came to help load the U-Haul. One of his friends had a van, and he put a mattress in the back for Max to lay on when he needed to rest. The day after we arrived in Oregon, we took Max and Mom up to show them where their new home would be. Max seemed really happy to be here with all the family. 4 days later, he started throwing up. He couldn't walk again and was hardly able to talk. We called an ambulance and took him to our local hospital in Eugene. He was so dehydrated they couldn't get an IV in. They couldn't use a subclavian IV as his clavicle had been broken in 8 places in one of his accidents. So they had to insert an IV in his groin. They tied down his leg.
What was the purpose of tying his leg down?
To keep the needles, the IV from breaking off in the groin area, because he was thrashing around in pain, and so they tied his leg down to keep it still.
Oh, the poor guy.
Yeah. On September 20th, my birthday, he slipped into a coma. But he came to the next day. He was trying to get out of bed. I told him he had a needle in his leg and would break it. He was very weak and couldn't speak, but he got the strength from somewhere to grab my shirt, pull me close to him, and in a very clear voice, he said, "You have to get me out of here." There was a nurse in the room, and I asked him to get the doctor. I told the doctor what he said, and I asked Max if he wanted to go home. He shook his head yes. Sorry.
That's okay.
I asked him if he wanted to be with Dad and Jeff. They had both passed away previously. He shook his head yes. The doctor said that it was not an unreasonable request. She arranged for us to be put in a special large room so the family could be with him until arrangements were made. We spent the night there. He was taken off of his IV. The fluid from it was building in his lungs and making it very difficult for him to breathe. When the ambulance brought him home, I said, "Max, you're home now." He opened his eyes and gave me a big smile.
I know that this is very difficult for you now as it was then.
He died 2 days later in my home. not a quitter at anything life dealt him. Valley fever was the one thing he could not overcome. I want to thank both of you for everything you have done and are doing to help fight this horrible, devastating disease. Sharon was my lifeline through all of this. She talked with me many times on the phone and through emails with advice and support. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my brother's story.
I want to thank you, Kathy, for your willingness to tell your brother Max's story. And of course, I don't know about anybody else who listens to this, but it's hard not to cry along with you. It is an honor and a privilege to hear what a wonderful person Max was. And you should know that his memory and legacy will live on through your heart and the hearts of those that hear his story.